ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the inaugural, formerly first episode of World Matters. My name is Eric Kavanaugh. I'll be your host, and with me is Richard Kerby, UN veteran, dialing in all the way from the other side of the planet. He's out there in the United Arab Emirates today doing some interesting business, and we're going to talk about what's happening around the world. So first of all, just a quick nod. Richard, how's it going out there, buddy?
It's going great. It's a bit hot out here. It's over 110 every day, but that's life.
That's good. Okay, folks, we're going to go 30 minutes today. Our show is going to blossom to a full hour, I understand, starting next week. And we're going to talk about what's going on in a couple different places around the world. And I'm just going to give a bit of an opening monologue here to give you some of my experience on a pretty hot topic these days. I think one of the most notorious countries in the world so far as U.S. politics is concerned, and the U.S. in general these days, is, of course, Mother Russia. And I know a lot about Russia. I actually have studied Russia and Russian culture, believe it or not, since the age of 7. So we're talking 43 years now I've been studying Russia in one form or another. I was fascinated by it, wrote a paper on it when I was in the 5th grade. Actually spent some time working very closely with a Russian firm with ties to the Kremlin, as they say. I'll talk about that in just a second. My wife also knows a lot about Russian. My wife speaks Russian. She lived in Russia, in Moscow, for about a year and a half, and in fact was there when the tanks surrounded the White House back in the 90s, when the Soviet Union was falling apart and everything was going crazy. She was there. In fact, her boyfriend and she lived a few blocks from there, and so they actually watched that whole thing go down in person, which you can imagine was pretty stunning. I don't think any American can truly imagine what it would look like to see our tanks surrounding our White House. You can't even imagine that here in the States, thank goodness. She saw that. She lived through it. She's experienced it in great depth. And like I say, she speaks Russian. And in fact, when she went to Russia, it was rather discombobulating to her family, especially her father, because her father was born in Hungary, and he actually left the country in the middle of the night in the late 1950s, I guess 57 maybe, or 56, when the Russian tanks rolled in. And I can tell you that the sentiment in Hungary at the time, based upon all the testimony I've heard, was just shock, was real deep surprise and dismay, because by and large, the Hungarians viewed Russia as their brethren. They viewed Russia as their brothers, and they really didn't understand what was going on. So there's obviously a very long history here, folks, and I always try to remind myself, especially if you're talking about and considering world matters per se, you have to remember history goes back tens of thousands of years. I mean, maybe not in the place called Russia today. It may not be that far back, but we don't really know how far back a lot of this stuff goes. We have some idea based on carbon dating and so forth, and we can look to Mesopotamia and areas like that for where the human race arguably began. And then obviously they spread out all over the planet and all over the world. So I want to share just some quick thoughts with all of you about Russia. And I have to say I'm really disconcerted with just the tone and the angles on all the commentary, right? So first of all, we keep hearing about how Russia hacked our election. Well, let's just be honest. That's a very vague term, to say the very least. There's no doubt that there are tons of Russian hackers, and there are hackers all over the Ukraine. There are hackers in China. There are hackers in every country around the world. In Australia, of course, in the United States. Hacking is a whole thing, and it's actually been quite normalized. If you look at our language, what we talk about in society today, you see this term everywhere now, growth hackers. I'm a growth hacker. Like, wait a minute, I thought hacking was bad. No, hacking is just basically using computers to gain access to systems. There's good hacking and there's bad hacking. So first of all, yes, there's no doubt that there are Russian hackers. Our websites have been hacked on multiple occasions. We could trace it back to Russian sources, to Ukrainian sources. I actually work with developers from the Ukraine, and they'll even tell you, oh yeah, there are a lot of bad hackers in our country. They know it. Everybody knows it. That's a whole industry, just so you know. That's a whole industry. There's a certain persona of the hacker that is portrayed on TV as a guy in a hoodie in a dark room, as a lone wolf, and that's just nonsense. the hacking industry is multi-leveled, it's multi-layered, it's very sophisticated, and it's very well run. Quite frankly, there are different roles that people play, like hacking into systems. Once they get some data, then they sell it upstream to someone else who can use the data. It's a very sophisticated and very deep and complicated enterprise these days, hacking is. So, yes, for sure, there are hackers in Russia. There are hackers everywhere, is I guess the point I'm making. But where I'm kind of driving with this is that and this is the problem I see in American media in general, is that everything has become so politicized. And I've been just kind of stunned and amused to watch how the reputation of Russia and its leadership has transformed from, inconsequential and oafish to world-dominating and Machiavellian almost overnight. I mean, it was basically at the end of the last administration here in the U.S., but all of a sudden, oh my gosh, they're a huge threat. Well, that's a little bit silly. There is a lot of truth to it, just in terms of geopolitical affairs and so forth, but I just wanted to set some context. So, like I say, I have a lot of experience working with Russians, dealing with Russian culture, dealing with something I jokingly call Russian business ethics. There's a different ethical construct in different countries. This varies from country to country all around the world, I promise you. The U.S. is a unique place. We are very similar to countries like Australia, for example, to the U.K., where we came from, and other countries like that. But every country has its own dynamics, its own mores, its own constructs, its own way of doing business, quite frankly, its own way of doing governance. Well, the guy that I've worked for, who was a Russian, was really quite an interesting character. This is a company I worked for from 1999 into 2000, first remotely and then up in New York. It was called KMGI.com. KMGI.com did webmercials. So there were three people: Alexander Kananikian, Nikolai Minchukov, who is still one of my best friends, brilliant man. In fact, Nikolai founded Greatest, which was the first ever, that we know of, advertising company in Russia. Because you remember, back before Perestroika under Gorbachev, back before that, the government basically ran everything. So if the government runs everything, why do you need an advertising agency? You don't, is the point. So Nikolai launched a company called Greatest, and it became the greatest advertising. It was the only one for a while, but very, very prolific, very successful advertising agency in Russia. And Nikolai is a brilliant man. He's taught me all kinds of things. He had one great quote I'll never forget. And Richard, I'll let you come in here in a couple minutes. I just want to finish this thread. But he had this great quote, because he's a designer, but he's also a coder, a programmer. He actually built an email marketing platform that I used for probably 6 years called 3C Manager, I think. And he said to me, because he really is such an intelligent guy, and he really dug into the code and the operating systems and .NET and all that stuff. And he said to me one day, the funny thing about the web is that nobody knows how it works. All we know is it works. And his point is actually pretty well taken, because what has happened with technology, internet technology, and we talked about hacking and all this stuff, is that you have these devices that connect. The whole concept of Ethernet, for example, of connectivity across devices, that's, of course, relatively new stuff, and it's still borderline mystifying. I can tell you that stuff like I/O, input-output, in database terms, in throughput for big data and things of this nature, is still kind of black magic, even to this day. We've had some tremendous advances in the recent past, but I/O is still kind of weird and kind of a mystery. There's a lot of stuff that we really just don't even know, even as we do amazing things like artificial intelligence. So anyway, where I'm going with this is Nikolai was the good guy. Alexander Kananikian, not so much. Alexander was one of We's kids of post-Soviet Russia, and I say that because that's what he would talk about. He made a ton of money as a student. Now remember, this is Russia. This is like early 1990s. So Gorbachev had this Perestroika program, which was basically renaissance or rebuilding or restructuring, because Gorbachev realized that the old ways of doing business were not going to last in this new world. And again, this is quite a while ago now. We're talking, 40 years ago, just about, or 35 years ago and change. And a lot has changed since then. If you look at GDP, my goodness, the GDP of the USA is like, $20 trillion now. Well, I remember I did some research in 2004 or 5 on GDP, gross domestic product for different countries. And according to the World Bank, in the year 2000, is that right? Yeah, the year 2000, the GDP of the United States was $10 trillion. The GDP of Russia back then was, take a guess, just write something down on a piece of paper. It's going to surprise you. Remember, at the time, the U.S. and Russia were the two world powers. It was bilateral. That was the understanding. China was still a rising nation. It was a bilateral situation. The U.S. and Russia were the two major powers. Well, the World Bank pegged their GDP at $350-something billion. Now, let's think about this. How on earth could one superpower have a GDP that was nearly 30 times the size of the other, of Russia? And I had to think about this for a long time before I finally figured it out after learning some hard lessons of working with a Russian with curious business ethics, namely Alexander Kananikian. Well, Alexander made millions of dollars as a student. And as he explained to me, back in the day, you were in what's called Komsomol. Komsomol is it's a program for young people, but it's like Social Security in the U.S. Like, you have to have a Komsomol account number, a credit, if you will, and you would do public service to get that. And you had to have that if you were going to be successful in Russian culture. So what the key is, the authorities wouldn't focus on students. And Alex was very smart, and he used the Internet to do commodities trading back in the early 90s. So he would see lumber is selling for 1 ruble a pound over here, and it's being bought for 5 rubles a pound over there. Well, buy, sell. He did that significantly for a couple of years and amassed a remarkable fortune of almost $25 million or so. He then got into politics because he wanted to change things, and so he financed a political outsider whom he thought was a revolutionary in a way, or at least a pragmatist in terms of democracy and things of this nature. And that person got into office, and then very strange things started to happen. He just started rising up and up and up, and then Alex wound up financing his presidential campaign. And you may recognize this guy's name as Boris Yeltsin. So my client, former boss, Alexander Kananikian, you can look him up. Look up KMGI.com. He's still out there. Still owes me $25,000 on a commission, right? That's kind of how I learned the hard lessons here. But he made all this money, financed Yeltsin's campaign, got him into office. When he was in office, Alexander got 3 things. He got Mikhail Gorbachev's personal home. He got a security detail of 300 former KGB, including colonels. And he also got one of 3 licenses to run an international bank. Right? Well, this is a big deal because, remember, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the ruble went into a free fall, the banks collapsed. What do? Now you have to get lots of cash in. It was a real crazy scramble for a while. And if you do the math and realize what happened since then, well, the oligarchs moved in. And so not to get too far off topic here, but I wanted to kind of give some context about my experience with Russians, including good and bad. And they're angels and devils, as my business partner Robin Bloor once told me. Angels and devils over there in Russia. And the angels are wonderful people, and the devils will not think twice about really socking it to you. And in fact, one of my jokes is that some of these guys, the bad guys, will not only rip you off, like openly rip you off, but when you call them on having ripped you off, they'll laugh at you and say, well, yeah, of course we ripped you off, you idiot. We thought you knew that. You're even stupider than we thought. It's a real eye-opening experience, right? So this is something I've experienced myself in my personal life. And I'm offering this context to remind us that we're not that much different from any other country. We do have different, again, mores and laws and social structures and so forth, but we're not that different. There's an old cliche that I love, which says the devil isn't as black as he's painted. Because you don't hear that much, very, very much anymore. But it's a very good cliche. It's very revealing. And it's a bit misleading to some people. It doesn't say that the devil isn't bad. The devil is the devil. But the point is the devil isn't as black as he's painted means it's actually not as bad as we make him out to be. And that's because we're trying to create separation between badness and ourselves. Just the human ego does that. Well, so to close the point here, and then I'll bring Richard in for commentary, what I really learned over the years of studying Russia and Russian culture and studying U.S. culture and U.S. governance and policies and technology and all these things, if you remember back, those of you who are in your 40s or 50s or older, in the 70s and the 80s, let's face it, we had a lot of propaganda fed to us about Russia. It was the Cold War. They were the enemy. Sting wrote a song, I hope the Russians love their children too, all this stuff. We had a lot of propaganda telling us they're the bad guys. And I remember what we were told. Pretty funny. Remember, we were told that the institutions are falling apart, the phone systems don't work, government agencies don't work, you have to wait in line for 10 hours to get toilet paper, like all this stuff, a lot of which had truth to it, no doubt about it. We heard all these stories about the institutions not working well, and the government owns everything, and so people don't really own anything, they're not free, et cetera, et cetera. Well, fast forward to 2008 or so in the United States. I don't know if you all have noticed this, but a lot of our institutions are faltering. A lot of, phone systems just have more increasing problems. Cable companies have problems. A lot of things aren't working very well. And then there's that whole thing about government ownership. So here's something we'll pick up on a future show, I'm sure. Many of you remember in 2008, the big financial collapse, when the money market field just hollowed out and brought everything down with it. The stock market crashed. It was just mayhem. Crazy things were happening. It was right between administrations, the George W. Bush administration and the Barack Obama administration. Well, you may recall the two of them agreeing on something, and that was my first red flag. I'm like, wait a minute, why are these guys agreeing about something? And there was this push to do this tremendous investment in the economy and to float up, to basically prop up the banks. Now remember, these banks are the ones that overbid. They basically speculated to a dangerous degree, and they went insolvent, so they could no longer pay their bills. They could no longer pay their debtors, their creditors, anyway, they were screwed. And I've spent a lot of years studying the risk management space, and a lot of the smart people I know say they really wish we would have just let them fail, because the green shoots would have come up and we would have propped up the system. As it turns out, that's not how it worked. And the Fed basically, I think, quadrupled over that period of time. That's through what's called quantitative easing. Well, quantitative easing, look it up, QE1, QE2, QE3, it's still going, actually. They still have not divested themselves of all these assets that they bought, but the Federal Reserve, in essence, bought up what are these, they're called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, all right? These were mortgage-backed securities that were then collateralized, meaning wrapped up in a package and sold to people. So they were sold to institutional investors, basically. Well, the government came in and bought that. The government came in and bought the CDOs. Well, what are CDOs? Mortgage-backed securities are basically usually bad loans, loans that went bad. Because what happened, of course, to trigger the collapse, and Goldman Sachs was right at the heart of all this. Goldman Sachs actually pulled the string that brought down the economy. I'm not sure if everyone knows that, but Goldman was on both sides of this equation. And what happened is Goldman is a mark-to-market firm. And what that means is their policy is to look at whatever their assets are and mark those assets to their fair market price. Well, prices go up and down. Housing prices go up and down. And what happened was at a very specific point in time, there's a book called House of Cards. You should look up if you want to read about this. But there's a guy who gave a speech at a risk management conference that I saw who talked all about this. There's a point in time where an email thread went out there, and the top guy who handled all the major institutional accounts said to all his reps, said, okay, guys, we're going to be pulling the string here. We're going to mark down the value of these assets, and there's going to be a ripple effect. You tell your people, get out now and get out quick. Otherwise, there's going to be blood, right? So the point is, too many people walked away from their loans at scale. That was basically the lending for folks who had high interest rates, ARMs. Remember the ARMs, adjustable rate mortgages? Where you put your arm behind your back and stick it up towards your skull so you get in pain and give up. Too many people walked away from their loans. that created a catastrophe at scale in the financial services industry. The government came in, bought up all these CDOs, quadrupled its balance sheet from like $800 billion to almost $4 trillion. Well, what is that? What do they own? Remember what I said about Russia? The argument was, oh, well, the government owns everything. Basically, what happened is the government, the U.S. government, essentially bought roughly half of the mortgage loans in America. So what am I saying? I'm saying that we're kind of becoming what we beheld. If the government owns half of the mortgage loans, and this is still true today, they have not yet divested all of these assets. We're still waiting to unwind all that stuff. And I would argue this is why housing prices have gone through the roof, because the government owns half of the mortgage loans or thereabouts. Someone can correct me on numbers. So why am I saying all this? Right? I'm saying all this just to put some perspective out there. We keep hearing Russia hacked our election. Of course, people have been meddling in elections since the dawn of time, literally since the dawn of time, since the dawn of governance that's been going on. And it upsets me to see that all this rhetoric and the so-called narrative, which I would say is nonsense. When you hear the word narrative, I would argue someone's about to lie to you about something, or at least fabricate some storyline to push their agenda. And I don't like that. I don't want that. And one of the purposes of this show is really to share with you, our audience, just some perspective and some insights from what we've seen. And we're going to go around the world and talk about different countries. And with that very long opening monologue, I apologize for taking up so much time, Richard. I'm going to hand it over to you for some commentary. What do you think about all that, and what do you think about this Russia story?
Well, thank you, Eric. I must say I like your Russian accent as well. Essentially, this is President Putin's way of trying to reorganize the USSR, which was a major player in the world today. I mean, all Russia has right now, it's petrol and its military. If you look at the international trade, they're not able to import and export. So how does the great Russia become back to the USSR, where it becomes more relevant and more powerful? So that's one of the issues that Putin's trying to do. And you saw the issue about what happened in the Ukraine and the extension of Crimea and so forth. So Putin's trying to do. Now, whether or not President Trump is going in the right direction, different directions as well. So I get what you say about all these happenings in both Russia and the United States. And to me, one of the key interests is what, who has the purse strings, who has control of the money. And so when the Democrats are power, Republicans are attacking, and when Republicans are in power, the Democrats are attacking. So it's all a matter of who's controlling the money. And I think that's one of the issues that we see all this kind of discourse between the two parties. Once you're in power, you have trillions of dollars at your hand to distribute. And I think that's the major flaw in the current U.S. system, is that it's just too much money involved. And therefore, you tend to push your party more than the others to try to bring them down. And to me, that's un-American. You want whoever's the president to succeed. You don't want them to fail. You want them to succeed, whether it's Democrat or Republican. And that's, to me, is the crux of the argument here.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I just look around, and like you, Richard, I just want an honest dialogue about what's happening. And I think it's more information to get there, and we need more perspective, right? I mean, I have a lot of very personal perspective and engagement in business world and, of course, in the theoretical world, just thinking about this stuff. But business is business. And, I remember Alexander, he would always want to promote what he called his adventure story. And he wanted to use it for publicity purposes, which is very effective. 60 Minutes did a bit on him. You could probably dig that up somewhere. But I remember talking to him about this and suggesting, because he's a very nice guy, he's very plausible, kind of a not that deep of a voice, very tall, like thick, bright blue eyes, classic Cossack, actual genetics. Brilliant man. He was a rocket scientist, right? And I remember talking to him about his plan to use this adventure story where he said, the KGB stole my bank and they stole my assets and I had to run away. He's actually the first Russian ever to get political asylum in America. It was back in, I guess, 93 or 94. And in fact, Judge Ellis...
Eric, I think we're running out of time here. I think we're down to the last... you might want to wrap.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that, the show's about to end. I think the issue that I want to add one last line, business and ethics culture plays a very important role, whether you're an American or Russian or any other country in the world. It's your business ethics that are becoming important. And I think most countries should have a more corporate structure or governance structure that allows you to be ethical instead of being unethical.